Greetings and welcome to Education in Focus, powered by Chalkboard News. I'm Dan McCaleb, Vice President of News and Content at the Franklin News Foundation, which publishes chalkboardnews.com. Chalkboard is a news website dedicated to issues related to K-12 education. Joining me again today is Chalkboard's K-12 editor, Brendan Clary. How are you, Brendan?
I'm doing well, Dan. Got the leaves raked up and sort of gotten everything ready for winter here. How about yourself?
I got a lot of my leaves up over the weekend, but I know more are coming. Still plenty on the trees, so that's probably another at least 2-week process for me. Brendan, let's get into it. We are recording this on Tuesday, November 14th. We've known for quite a while that shutting down schools for months on end during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic was a pretty big mistake. It led to widespread learning loss, setting students back by as much as a year or more, according to research, and leading to other unintended consequences. Brendan, the Pacific Research Institute released a study recently reviewing the impacts of the various approaches that states took when dealing with the pandemic, and we covered that at Chalkboard News. Tell us more.
Yeah, so I mean, you're absolutely right. There's been a lot of studies after the fact, right after COVID, that this had long-term deleterious effects on students. Not only their grades, but also their mental health. There's been a lot of different ramifications for saying you can't see your friends, you can't go outside, and live life the way that you used to live, that you were accustomed to living. Right. And so, there are these test score data that have come out and that I've reported on at Chalkboard News throughout the course of the year. I mean, it's like every single one that comes out is just another wave of maybe disappointing news with maybe some bright spots just starting to show up. But I mean, we had the 2019 class of the freshmen who started in the COVID-19 pandemic era, right? They've graduated in 2023. So, we're starting to sort of filter into students who've only had part of their time maybe influenced by that, or maybe they were younger students, so maybe there's more opportunities for learning loss. It's really interesting to see how that develops. But most of the research that has come out, or the test scores, for example, in October, the ACT test scores showed a decline for the 6th year. And, a lot of students were missing, these key college benchmarks and just sort of these larger things. So to put that into perspective, too, you kind of have these questions about, well, what states how states reacted to COVID-19 and how did that change the metric on student performance, right? And so that was an interesting fact that was reported on in Chalkboard last week, just about how there are the different reactions that states had and how stringent they were. That had an impact on test scores. So the Pacific Research Institute, they looked into what are the changes, and they found that high intervention states, those states that had more stringent COVID-19 guidelines, different allows, maybe different school closure things, they had lower test scores in terms of math proficiency than low intervention states, right? They had slightly better math proficiency. So it's just a very interesting, you can sort of, going back now, you can quantify, those states who were very limited in what students were able to do versus states that were pushing to open sooner.
Right, but and for this story, we talked to Wayne Weingarten, who's one of the authors of the Pacific Research Institute study, and he cautions that, hey, COVID-19, the pandemic there, first time had such a pandemic, wide-reaching pandemic in our lifetime, but he notes that, hey, this could happen again. We don't know when, we don't know how far in the future, but we need to learn, essentially, from what we learned in the aftermath of COVID-19 and these school shutdowns, et cetera, to make sure we're better prepared and know that, hey, if you shut down schools for any period of time, students are going to experience some learning loss. Any thoughts?
No, I think that that's absolutely it. And I think that, that's sort of the trend of the data that I've seen is a lot of people are saying, well, we know a lot more now, and we know, that students were not as at risk for COVID-19 mortality, right, as maybe the elderly, right? So that students were not at such great risk of fatality due to COVID-19, and in many cases that risk was pretty small. And so I think that going forward, thinking about those kinds of risks. And I mean, the hard part with that is that in the beginning, nobody really knew much at all. So some of this, we're looking back and we're saying, well, hindsight is 2020, right? We can see now that, there are these, we know a lot more about it. At the same time, that I think there are people who seem to remember that time, and maybe they are thinking about mask mandates, or they're thinking about the different kinds of voices. I know that's come up, something I've written about. There was a congressional hearing about the teacher union role in school closures, right? And maybe this voice to try to keep schools closed. And something that they point to is, that there was a lot of stuff that was unknown and about safety and about those kinds of things. But I think largely speaking, we can look back and say it was very harmful to students to do this. And there was that very high cost, and that's mentioned in the piece, right? Billions of dollars are being spent, will have to be spent to try to get students to a place where they are, succeeding again, or that they're reaching the academic achievement of pre-pandemic students, right? And something that I've written about quite a bit is what one researcher calls COVID credentials, right? The fact that the graduation, these diplomas for students during the pandemic, they basically said, we don't want you to feel left out. We're going to give you a diploma, even though you have not learned as much as people, 4 years before you, and that kind of thing. So I think that is a tough part about this as well, is, where there's just some of this unprecedented stuff. And in the future, there are a lot of lessons to glean from this, but really there's also a lot of work that has to be done to try to help the students who are impacted by this the most, right? And there's a lot of different ways to try to figure out how to do that, and those are a lot of good policy questions. But that's sort of the hardest part about this, is that has been done, the damage has been done to students, and it's pretty quantifiable now at this point in terms of what I was talking about before, in terms of the high and low intervention states and their the grade differences between them on math or on reading, those kinds of things. And so you're absolutely right, Dan.
Well, Brendan, thank you as usual for your insight into this very important story, but that is all the time we have. Listeners can keep up with all stories related to K-12 education at chalkboardnews.com. For Brendan Clary, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe, and thank you for listening.